Is Sudan descending into a protracted civil war? Is its transition to civilian rule now a thing of the past? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Khalid Medani. Dr. Khalid Mustafa Medani is Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He is the author of Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, and is presently completing a manuscript on the causes and consequences of Sudan's 2018 popular uprising. Khalid Medani, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
It's a pleasure to be back in Connections, Mouin. Thank you very much for your attention to Sudan as usual.
Well, you've certainly helped us understand it and enlightened us about its issues in the past. And as you know, we've unfortunately had to rely on your expertise once again because Sudan is now in the midst of a bloody crisis. And to jump right in, perhaps you can start by explaining what are the basic facts about what's happening now in Sudan. When and how did this start? Is this simply a power struggle between the Sudanese military led by General Abdel Fattah Burhan, who's also chairman of Sudan's Transitional Sovereignty Council, between him and the Rapid Support Forces led by General Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, known as Hemeti, who serves as Burhan's deputy in the TMC?
Well, in many ways, it is absolutely a power struggle, as most commentators have said, between Abdel Fattah Burhan, who's the general and head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti, as he's known, who's the head of the Rapid Support Forces militia. So there is definitely that central element of a power struggle. But we have to go back a little bit. Maybe your listeners would want to know some of the context and the background. And I would really look at and focus on the coup of October 2021.
Yes, and that was going to be my next question, is if you can help us place the present crisis in its broader political context and background.
Yeah, the coup of October 2021 was the very important coup that upended and basically rolled back the efforts of the revolution of 2018-2019. That was kind of a seminal part of, let's just say, the counter-revolutionary forces. In that period and in that moment, there was an alliance between Hemeti and Burhan, and that is something that it's very important to clarify. Following that, because neither one of them, and I want to emphasize this because it is not always emphasized, and neither of them have real constituency in Sudanese civil society. In other words, their very weakness, despite their military strength and coercive strength, led them to have to compromise once again with civilians. In this case, the main civilian opposition bloc, the Forces of Freedom of Change Central Council. And the reason for that is that the protest by the resistance committees and by civil society in general and the Sudanese people unanimously against the coup persisted almost on a daily level. Because of that situation and the inability of Burhan to actually even appoint a government, he was forced to once again return to the negotiation table with the FCC, the civilian opposition. And they attempted to negotiate what is known as the framework agreement. And that was extremely important. It had a number of different stipulations, but for now—
Sorry, we're talking 2021 now.
We're talking December 2022 when it was signed. Yeah. But the negotiations, of course, precede that throughout.
And the background is that Burhan and Hemeti, if I understand you correctly, they had a lot of power, but not much legitimacy.
Exactly. A lot of coercive power, no legitimacy in civil society, except, of course, with respect to their own forces and rank and file. And it's very important to emphasize Burhan has continued, because of that weakness in terms of legitimacy, to ally himself to members of the deposed regime of the Islamist movement and the National Congress Party. This is
of the ousted President Omar al-Bashir.
The catalyst for this present conflict had to do with the conflict over a very contentious issue associated with integrating this paramilitary militia of Hemedtis into the standing army. What happened as a precursor to that is that in March of 2023, there was a conference, a workshop that was supposed to iron out this kind of integration, unification of the armed forces.
Sorry, just to interrupt you again, but just to be clear, as you mentioned, the Rapid Support Forces are a paramilitary force and not part of the formal armed forces of Sudan. And there's been a process that was supposed to lead to their integration into the formal armed forces, correct?
That's correct. It's that framework agreement or accords that were signed in early December December 2022, that were supposed to iron out a number of different issues. I do want to emphasize those issues in a bit, because really they can tell us not only the catalyst of this conflict, but how we can look towards the future in terms of some scenarios. But in this case, in late March of 2022, a workshop was convened where all of the actors associated with these negotiations were supposed to iron out this integration. And here is where the real dispute occurred. For Burhan, he wanted the integration of these militias to have a very short timeline, 2 years, and Hemedti insisted that they should be 10 years, effectively rejecting integration into the standing army. And the reason for that is quite simple and straightforward, of course. He did not want to give up his political power and certainly his military power and the vast wealth in gold and other commodities and real estate that he had built up over the years. It is at this point that the tensions really mounted. Basically, Burhan kicked members of the militia forces who were in the talks out of the workshop. And it was immediately after that that we saw increasing deployment in Khartoum by the Rapid Support Forces already there, although they'd already been there, and in Medawi, in the northern town of Medawi, not far from Egypt. It is that kind of mobilization of troops that catalyzed this kind of conflict, where both of them at this point view the situation as a zero-sum game. Whoever wins gets not only to consolidate his military power, but potentially from their perspective to actually rule the country and upend all of the work of the revolutionaries that have fought so hard for a transition to a full civilian democracy. So this is by way of understanding the contemporary catalyst of this particular conflict.
Yeah, so but if I understand correctly, this is not really a conflict about whether to move forward with the transition or to suspend it. This is really about which military leader will be in charge of Sudan. And it seems there's already a consensus among the two that there should be no transition. It's just about, as you put it, who will rule Sudan moving forward.
Yes, that is really what the military situation is at this point. Now, having said that, the issue is that neither of them, as we said before, have any kind of support or legitimacy in civil society. So there's a political aspect to the story as well. The military aspect we see, unfortunately, in Khartoum and
let's go back to this a minute, because the crisis erupted 3 or 4 days ago in Khartoum initially. And would you characterize it as an attempted coup by Hemedti and the RSF against the Transitional Military Council in an attempt to neutralize the armed forces? Or were these just small-scale local clashes that then rapidly escalated? How would you characterize the actual eruption of the crisis?
I would categorize it as an attempted coup, similar to the attempted coups what we've seen in Sudan. We've had, unfortunately, 16 attempted coups and other coups in Sudan. I would characterize it as such. The majority of commentators in Sudanese would characterize it as such, rather than a civil conflict or simple skirmishes. So the political ambition and the economic kind of interest of these two individuals are really very much the cause of this conflict. And that's why it should and must be seen as a conflict, basically a palace coup, so to speak, between members of leaders in the security apparatus. However, of course, this is a factionalized apparatus which dates back to the period of the Umar Bashir regime.
And these clashes quickly spread beyond Khartoum and Durman, and are now, I think, taking place in numerous cities and regions across Sudan. The armed forces has deployed the Air Force, presumably to bomb RSF bases. Is there now a generalized conflict taking place in Sudan? And related to that, I mean, you've been in regular contact with people in Sudan. How are ordinary citizens experiencing this conflict? Are the clashes confined to specific and defined areas, or has it paralyzed daily life throughout the country?
Well, it has paralyzed daily life, certainly in Khartoum. It's difficult to be sure, but from what we know, the conflict is, of course, in Khartoum and the greater Khartoum capital city. It is definitely in Merowe, in the naval base or air base there in the town of Merowe in the north, and skirmishes also in the Red Sea and in Darfur. Now, Mouin, I should say that the country is very large, and so yes, it is not right now spread throughout the country. And in Jazeera, in Kordofan, these areas, the reason I mentioned that is because of the devastation in Khartoum. Increasingly, Sudanese are fleeing to their relatives in other parts of the country where it's safe and where it's quiet.
But are you saying that, as you mentioned, Sudan is largest country in both Africa and the Middle East? Are you saying these other areas are relatively quiet, or that we don't really have reliable information on the rest of the country?
So far, our information is that, and some of it is reliable, that the devastation is very much in Khartoum, Darfur, the Red Sea, and definitely Merowe. We do have some reliable information from people from Jazeera, Central State, and Kordofan that it's more quiet. Now, that should not, of course, really diminish the humanitarian crisis. The reason I'm mentioning it is to emphasize that this is a conflict not between the Sudanese people as of yet, but rather between these two individuals and their militias and forces. So that's extremely important to emphasize. Within Khartoum, the situation is very dire. There are a lot of conflicting reports in terms of who has the military kind of victory, or who's consolidated what part of the greater city, but the aerial bombardments continue. We do know that the militia forces are not only have killed up to maybe over 180 people, if not more, but they're entering people's houses. The humanitarian crisis is compounded by, as you can imagine, the problem with basic supplies such as water, electricity, and medical supplies are very, very much in short supply. And so that is not reflected in the kind of civilian death toll that people mention in the news. So I want to emphasize that. If you don't mind me saying, in typical Sudanese fashion, and that occurs, of course, elsewhere, you have the reemergence of the activity of the resistance committee and neighborhood committees who are doing their best to really provide whatever they can support through their networks to people. That, of course, doesn't make up for the humanitarian crisis, but people are trying to help each other, of course.
Yes, because I think a spokesman of the Doctors Union, the Professional Association of Sudanese Medics, indicated that its members, for example, are unable to reach hospitals where they would normally work, and similar issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really, really important aspect of this conflict. But I did want to talk about the political situation as well, because the emphasis, of course, is on the military situation and the humanitarian crisis. But I wanted to go and return to some of the context in the debate in Sudan on the political side, because everyone is also looking at who supports whom in this kind of crisis. And in the case of Sudan, there is a great concern that the Islamist or former members of the National Congress Party are very much behind some of the design and agenda on the part of the armed forces, because it's governed by a committee that was basically the committee established by Omar Bashir prior to his ouster in 2019. The Intelligence and Security Committee, of which Burhan is a part, and others, Khobashi and others that Sudanese know, represents the remnants, as we say in Sudan, of the National Congress Party.
Just to be clear, do I understand correctly that you're saying that the remnants of Omar al-Bashir's regime are basically have thrown their support behind Burhan against Hemeti?
More than their support, there are indications that they were very much part of the planning and design of this. This does not, of course, absolve the violence meted out, but we return to the framework agreement in which there are a number of other aspects. There's a great deal of focus, Mouin, on the issue of integration. But if you look closely, and of course, all of us were following the negotiations and the workshops that were supposed to bring in more participation and stakeholders, there were two problems with the framework agreement. One of them is kind of intuitive, and that is that the timeline was very short in terms of its signing. And the other aspect was its inclusive nature. Number one, a number of civil society organizations were not included, and most importantly, the resistance committee from the beginning refused to cooperate with this agreement because their position is no cooperation, no legitimacy, no participation with the military. So that becomes really important. But among the workshops that were controversial to Burhan and his allies was a discussion of dealing with the economic aspects of the previous regime, a committee to dismantle the regime that emerged as something, a strong demand of the Sudanese people after the revolution of 2018, 2019. There was great progress made on that, but also that, of course, endangered Burhan and the allies in the National Congress Party and the Islamists.
Sorry, it was basically to dismantle the economic empire, for lack of a better word, that Omar al-Bashir and his entourage had constructed during their years in power.
That's exactly right. So there are two interests here that were undermined and led them to this kind of conflict. One of them, and to, of course, dissolve the framework agreement and negotiations. On the part of this committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee of the Armed Forces, headed by Burhan, nominally headed by Burhan, their interests were going to be undermined by this implementation and return to the dismantling the remnants and economic assets of the regime. On the other side, of course, the issue of actually integrating the rapid support forces undermined the interest and even existential existence of Hemeti. And here you have both leaders then essentially in opposition to the framework agreement. In that context, Hemeti tried to ally himself with the forces of democracy and civil society in order to undermine the power and influence of both Burhan and also the Islamists who he had increasingly appointed to the bureaucracy in lieu of not finding any other support. So I wanted to represent that picture because for Sudanese analysts and Sudanese on the ground, when you hear accusations both against Hemeti for his brutality in that fort and of course in Khartoum, you will also hear equally a criticism of the Sudan armed forces for their hidden agenda in entering into this war, wanting to have an outright victory in order to return members of the National Congress Party and the Islamist movement back in power. This is very important because this is exactly what the debate is in the context of this huge violence.
So it would basically be a revival of the old regime without its leader, Omar Bashir, who would now essentially be succeeded by Burhan. But you touch upon, I think, a more important point, which is that during the past few days, we've heard comparatively little about the activities and positions of Sudan's political movements and civil society, such as the Forces of Freedom of Change, the resistance committees, the professional associations, and so on. What is their role in the current crisis? Do they have a role in the current crisis? And what are the implications of this crisis more broadly for Sudan's anticipated transition to civilian rule?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I know it's difficult to look at the balance of civil society vis-a-vis these military forces because of the severity of the conflict. But there is a very important political context that that is very important. The issue of civil society and the forces of freedom of change is that they are a small, a narrow, group of political parties and civil society organizations. A number of very important political parties, let's say the Ba'athist and Nasserist, were refused to participate in the framework agreement. Even more importantly, and as I emphasized before, the Resistance Committee across the 18 provinces of Sudan refused in their unanimity to actually participate in the framework agreement.
And as you mentioned, that's because they refused to participate in any process that gave a clear, if not dominant, role to the Sudanese military, correct?
That's correct. But that, of course, is something that is well known. What is important and is obscured is that the resistance committees actually also refuse to participate because they have their own option. They have already, after the military coup of October 2021, began a process of actually drafting political charters to oversee the country towards a full civilian democracy. Two charters emerged in that period after the military coup, one in Medani, the state of Medani, and one in Khartoum. By April 2022, and this is extremely important, you had a unification, an agreement through consensus of a political charter entitled or labeled the Revolutionary Charter for the Establishment of People's Authority, of the People's Authority, which had a number of different elements that had to do with security sector reform, with the overseeing of a constitution, the representation in legislative assembly, a number of different issues associated with foreign policy and economic policy. In other words, we already had a draft circulating that was agreed upon by resistance committees and signed out of, I believe, 15 out of the 18 states. That in itself is obscured in the analysis, never mentioned by, of course, the forces. And also it posed a threat, in my opinion, to some of the elite political parties that did not want to include this kind of threat to their own interests. And that, unfortunately, left them basically a victim to two generals. Who would they pick? In the agreements, it seemed that they had to and were forced to side a bit with Hemeti in terms of his proposals of having autonomy, for example, for 10 years. And those kind of disputes between the civil society, political parties, elites, and the forces of the revolution itself and the young people give you a picture of not necessarily their ill will, or many would say that, of course, but their weakness vis-a-vis these two military or militarized forces. And it's very important to understand, because the discussion of resistance committees is that they're horizontal and leaderless, which is part and parcel of the organization. But in this context, we had a new development of an alternative to this kind of militarization, and an expansion, possible expansion of a democratic dispensation that would actually include the majority of the Sudanese people. And so that is something that will continue to emerge. And of course, over the course of the last 2 days, the resistance committees have reemerged in terms of their demands for ending the war and cessation of the violence, and also continuing this kind of struggle, frankly, in what is a cumulative revolution, or a revolution that's cumulative. And at least I just wanted to represent that perspective as well.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting that just when you would expect these types of groups to be further marginalized, because now the guns are speaking in the streets, if I understand you correctly, you're saying they're actually re-emerging as an active force now in Sudanese politics.
Well, they're re-emerging, and given the severity of the violence, the inability of Burhan to actually establish a government for upwards of 15 months or so, and the illegitimacy and the lack of popularity, despite his charm offensives over the years in terms of Hemeti, has really, from the perspective of the general population, made it more than clear that these are generals incapable of administering this country. That does not mean that there isn't discussion of a nightmare scenario of fragmentation and
Yes.
And volatility. But it's also important to understand that that is due to these two generals and the but the general understanding is that there has to be an option, and there has to be continued moves towards a struggle for a civilian governance that
Right.
goes towards democracy, because of the failure, essentially, of these two generals to even govern this country.
Khalid, I'd like to turn now to external factors in Sudan's current crisis. Are regional and/or international powers significant factors in the crisis? Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United Arab Emirates are often mentioned. Is this well, I think we all need to understand that this is primarily a conflict between key actors in Sudan. Is it also a proxy conflict?
It has been a proxy conflict, absolutely, and continues to be. I'm not sure if we have the time, but we have spoken about it before in terms of Hemeti's relationship to the United Arab Emirates through the exportation of gold. That was important. In 2015, both Burhan and Hemeti, I know many of your listeners who know the Middle East well, know the mercenaries that were sent by Hemeti and Burhan in cooperation with each other to fight on the part in Yemen. Hundreds of millions of dollars were given to Hemeti. It helped him build a huge apparatus, and of course to recruit even more soldiers for his militias across many parts of the country, but especially Darfur. So that relationship is very important. It has diminished in recent years because of the return of the mercenaries from Yemen, and the situation in Yemen that has changed, of course, and the fact that the Saudi Arabia has sought a kind of some kind of
cessation of hostilities.
Hostilities there. So that's very, very important. Another actor, of course, is Egypt, which is really central. I think there is absolutely no question that Egypt is siding with Burhan. And the first strikes, or some of the first strikes in Medawi, it's an air base that has witnessed, and at that time and continues to witness, joint operations between the Sudanese army and the Egyptian army. And so that's really important. You may have heard and seen videos of the captured Egyptian soldiers at the beginning of this conflict. And so that's really clear. Their interest, of course, in supporting Burhan because he would be a very important ally. I want to emphasize that in addition to the strategic interest of having an ally that would preserve their interest in the Nile waters as opposed to, and in their conflict with Ethiopia, the economic interest in the context of Egypt's deep economic crisis has very much to do with the smuggling and trade from northern Sudan, livestock and other goods that are an important part of the informal economy, in addition to investments in wheat. So there's a lot of interest in Egypt. In fact, the Egyptian government, what they did in the context of the framework agreement, as Hemeti and the groups in political parties seemed to be gaining traction, he organized a parallel kind of negotiations with other groups in Sudan, in Cairo, in order to bolster the strength of Burhan. And so clearly we have that kind of intervention. Sudanese know well, but I'm not sure if your viewers would be that familiar with that.
Well, and who are considered Hemeti's main foreign allies? You mentioned the Emirates. One hears sometimes Ethiopia, Russia. The position of Saudi Arabia is a little unclear, with some saying this could also be viewed as a kind of rivalry between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh in terms of the Saudis supporting the Sudanese armed forces and the Emirates supporting Hemeti. What do you make of all these various reports?
I think that what I make, Mouin, is that there's been a change since the last time we spoke, and because of the situation in Yemen and because of the pressure on the United Arab Emirates, the gold continues to be smuggled through informal and private means to Dubai and then taken elsewhere. But the utility of Hemeti as an ally from the perspective of the United Arab Emirates has diminished because of these changes in the region.
There's less of a need for his services.
There's less a need for his services. And the result of that has been his increasing desperation. Your question is very, very important, because as he's lost that support, he went before this conflict to Eritrea, of all places, to try to get assistance. Ethiopia is supporting him nominally, but they will not get involved in this conflict. And so he has lost that kind of patronage. And that is one of the reasons he decided that this, from his perspective, is the only shot he has to actually become the ruler of Sudan. And even more than that, he fears that there's going to be a whole kind of regional actors, including Egypt and others, who are going to decimate his forces and force him to demobilize.
So he sought to strike a fatal blow before his power is diminished further, essentially. Yeah, you've mentioned gold, you've mentioned mercenaries in Yemen, you've mentioned the economic structures that are the legacy of the Omar al-Bashir era. How and to what extent is a political economy of Sudan a relevant factor in the current crisis?
Well, it's always been a relevant factor to understand not only the current crisis, but the politics of Sudan since the coup of the Islamist regime led at that time by Omar Bashir in 1989. I'm not going to rehearse the long history, just to mention two pillars of that policy of the Islamist regime that are really central. What the Islamists in Sudan and Sudanese know well were called the policies of Tamkeen, the policies of empowerment. One of them was to factionalize the militias and to undermine the legitimacy and standing of the National Standing Army. And this, of course, has resulted and culminated in the rise of Hemeti and the Rapid Support Forces, in addition to other shadow brigades and other private militia. The other was a concerted effort to dominate the economy. It was from that beginning in earnest in the 1990s that the military and the Islamists combined in order to, by some estimation, really dominate about upwards of 60% of the economy in commodities, in real estate, and naturally in oil when there was oil. And so they built a vast empire that is, of course, referenced very often as a deep state that many of your listeners, viewers would be familiar with. In Sudan, people prefer to call it a parallel state to emphasize its illegitimacy and its weakness. And so this is really important. This conflict today, we can see very much on the part of Burhan and some of his allies as an attempt to really, as I said before, forestall any kind of upending of this vast economic empire, without which they wouldn't have any political role even in the country. And on the part of Hemeti, we can see his effort is to preserve his autonomous financial empire from, as he put it, the Islamist or Burhan. And so both of them are protecting not only, of course, their political careers and ambitions, but also it's very important to understand specifically that they are also protecting and trying to protecting their own vast financial assets. In
other words, they have a lot more to lose than just political power.
That's right, absolutely. And this is part and parcel of the difficulty of bringing them to the table. We can talk about the possibilities of military stalemate that can push them to the political table, but underlying that are also a very, very important aspect that they're fighting for that was threatened by these discussions around corruption and the dismantling of the assets of the military.
Finally, Khalid, I'd like to get your views on your expectations on the coming period. Is what we are witnessing now a short-lived failed coup attempt? Are we experiencing the opening salvos of a protracted civil war? Is a political transition in Sudan now a dead letter? Or do you expect to see the emergence of a renewed and perhaps strengthened campaign for civilian rule? What are your expectations? What are your fears? What are your aspirations for Sudan in the coming period?
Well, I think I'll begin with my fears because it's shared by the majority of Sudanese. I know some are watching, and of course, friends of Sudan and people in the region as well. The fear is that because of all of the reasons that you and I have outlined, that these two generals will in fact see this as a zero-sum game. And their allies also who are supporting them and would also see this as a zero-sum game, that there has to be an outright military victory. And although I'm
An
not—
elimination of the rival.
Elimination of the rival. The problem is that I'm not a military strategist, but the way that these militias have organized and were permitted to be organized as such for strategic reasons by Bashir and the former Islamist regime, and of course they're the perpetrators of the massacre of June 3rd that no Sudanese will forget, and they conspired to kill hundreds of peaceful protesters after throughout the protest and the revolution. And so the fear here is that there would be increasing violence in the long term that would destroy not only Khartoum, but would spread to the other parts of Sudan. I think that another aspect is a cautious hope or optimism that they will actually fail to get this outright victory and find that this is the only way for them to maintain a presence in Sudan politically or even economically is to get back to negotiations. And here I do think that the regional actors and the international actors you're talking about do have a role. After all, they had a role indirect and sometimes direct in emboldening them and enriching them. And they had also a role as part of the UN process of actually undermining the process towards transitional agreement. Many of us had said the timeline was too short. There was not enough people in civil society included, but there was only 1 month given for this framework to be signed, despite the fact that so many Sudanese and others really emphasized that this would probably happen if there weren't clear benchmarks with respect to all of these contentious issues that were deferred. And so the responsibility of the international community is huge. There are, of course, geostrategic interests that compel them, and that's why the countries from the African Union are very much trying to intervene. That intervention has to be robust, rigorous, but it has to learn from previous lessons and mistakes.
Well, and hopefully lessons of previous mistakes will be learned, and Sudan will be spared further suffering to that which it has already endured, not only in past years, but also specifically in the past several days. Khalid Medani, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections.
Thank you very much for having me and for all the coverage you do for Sudan and other countries as well. We all watch those as well. So.
Thank you, Khalid.